Thank you everyone for coming. So, hi, my name is Tim. I'm one of the co-founders of CRDN. So, really delighted to be here. And I'm also a co-founder of Healx. And that's a local startup focused on predicting treatments for rare diseases. So, you've just heard how patient groups can get involved in drug discovery. And now the next panel is really on the role of AI and technology to empower patients further. And we have an amazing panel here, and there will be no slides, so it's just a discussion. We'll also ask you to submit questions on Glisser and participate. And there's maybe one possible apology is Andy Richter's here. We've kind of messed the schedule around a little bit, so he has a super important board meeting in London, and we're running out. So he'll stay for as long as possible, and hopefully until the end of the panel. So to kickstart, we'll just ask each panelist to really briefly introduce themselves, but also explain what got them in the world of rare disease, because that's a really important point. Andy.
So thank you very much. This is a fantastic organisation, that's the first thing I'd say. And I really, really, really apologise for leaving. It looks dreadfully disrespectful, and you guys are the last people I would want to disrespect, because you are really, really important, and what this organisation does is important. So my name's Andy Richards. I'm an obsessive entrepreneur and investor in life sciences, I guess I've done some sort of 30 companies over the last 20 years, starting off very much in biotech, but then sort of moving a bit. I also advise a lot of funds, board of CI UK, do a lot of the stuff for the life science industrial strategy. But over the last few years, I've become very interested in this space where data meets healthcare and life sciences, and I really do see it as something that can change the inefficiencies, a lot of which we've heard, and I'm sure you'll hear more about those from Chaz later on, but currently are somewhat deeply frustrating in terms of the amount of knowledge that we're gaining, but the speed and translation of that through to benefiting patients. I've been doing a set of things in those areas. One of the ones most importantly, and one of the ones I'm most proud of, is Congenica, which has spun out from the Sanger Centre here. It comes out from that huge and wonderful study that you could only do in the UK that we spoke about earlier, called the Deciphering Developmental Disorders Project. Congenica is now at the heart of rare disease diagnosis and is integrating its technology into healthcare, and I'm pleased to say that the UK is in the front of this, involved with its 100,000 Genome Project leading to the Genetic Medicine Centres.
Okay, I'm David Brown. 40 years of trying to invent new medicines and still trying. Worked with several biotechnology companies and large pharmaceutical companies, expert in vascular diseases, infectious diseases, and now rare diseases, having met Tim 2013, I think it was, and we had the idea for starting Healx. So we're now developing AI systems to help find treatments for rare diseases.
Hi, I'm Elin Davies. My journey in the rare disease space started probably 25 years ago when I started working at Great Ormond Street Hospital, where pretty much all the diseases we cared for were rare. But I think particularly, as Tanya's already mentioned, my real passion in the rare disease space started when I met the children recruited for the Sofesca type 3 Gaucher disease study 18 years ago. Since then, I've sort of had a few different hats. I sort of went to academia to try and develop new outcome measures and endpoints for using in clinical trials, worked as a regulator at the European Medicine Agency for 6 years, linking the pediatric indication and the orphan designation. But for the last 5 years, I've sort of been looking at trying to find tech-enabled solution to change the way that we do clinical trials. So Aparito is based in Wales and Amsterdam, and we've currently had experience of developing new digital solution in 11 different rare diseases, using things from videos, voice, photos, wearables, and that kind of thing.
And I'm Pete Chan, Head of Research for Raremark. We're an online patient research network focused on rare diseases. My entry to the rare disease space happened about 10 years ago. In my previous job, I was an editor for an industry-facing news and analysis service. And if you might recall, back in 2010, there were some quite large corporate moves into the rare disease space. So GSK and Pfizer both established rare disease units, and Sanofi acquired Genzyme. So that's the kind of thing that gets the attention of an editor for a news service. But my interest back then was purely corporate. It was to say, well, why are the companies so interested in rare diseases? And it was carried on in that way for about maybe 6 to 9 months. Before I left that company, I had the chance to convene a panel, a bit like this, of people, different stakeholders in rare disease. So there was corporate, there was regulatory, there was consultants, and there's also patient advocates represented. And that really opened my eyes to the fact that there's something quite special about rare disease that is completely different from research in common diseases. And from that point on, I became a real advocate for rare disease research. And then I moved to my current company, which is Raremark.
Excellent, thank you, everyone. So in terms of applications of technology, this is such an exciting time because this is AI, machine learning, and other technologies for good. And it'd be good to maybe hear from the panel first, looking backwards, what they think the key technologies were that really empowered patients over the last 10 to 20 years. And some of those were already mentioned before, so let's not have too much repetition. But let's start. Who want to go first?
Yeah, so I am going to mention genomics. I really got religion on genomics back in 1996 in the first sort of wave of things, and then remember being euphoric coming onto this campus the day of the first publication of the first genome. And yet I feel deeply frustrated that I don't think it has delivered as much as we hoped and had promised at that stage. I remember starting a program in 1996 from a genomic company that my first company had just bought and invested in. And we started the program in 1996. Well, the drug from that program is just getting launched this year. And that tells you something about that. So I think it also really struggled. Everything was about putting genomics at the beginning of a long drug discovery process rather than putting it at the centre of patients and the clinical environment. I think that's the thing that's changing. Integrating any technology into genuine healthcare is really, really hard. And as an investor, it's a really brave thing to get involved in. But I do think the technologies that are coming are now allowed to do that. I'm deeply, I have the scars of trying to do that through Congenica in genomics rare disease diagnosis, but I think we've got through most of those. And I think that's really, really exciting. In terms of the other things that have changed, I don't think there's one technology. I think you need to look at this as waves of modalities that happen. If you go back to 25 years, if you go back to 95, 96, antibodies was a busted flush, and everyone was getting out of them. And 3 years later, antibodies was everything. Actually, that same time, gene therapy was everything, and it then went into its nadir, and now it's come back out. So I think we can see waves of things. We can see the wave of antibodies, we can see the wave of reprofiling, which I think is a genuine wave. I think we can see a wave of small molecule drug discovery. The next wave, gene therapy is clearly happening. The next wave, I think, is RNA. If we can solve the delivery program, the problem, I think it's RNA.
And we'll talk about the next wave afterwards.
Okay, I'll go through 4 things. I think genetics actually is incredibly important, particularly for rare diseases, because something like, I think it's a third of rare diseases have a single gene defect, another third have 2 or 3 gene defects. So something like 2/3 of rare diseases can be diagnosed through genetics, and that really is the critical first step. Relating to that, talking about RNA, I think that the transcriptomics, as we call it, the RNA expression is actually more important than the DNA itself, because DNA is silent, most of it. It's what it's doing that really matters. So the technologies for RNA sequencing are now, just now, this year, getting to the point where they're sufficiently cheap that they can be done on a mass scale. So I think that's going to lead to a massive change as well. The third is this word epigenetics. I don't know if you've come across this word. It's not well known outside the sort of deep bioscience community, but DNA is controlled by methylation, acetylation, etc., how it wraps around histones. And that epigenetic control is just being understood now, and is probably, again, more important than the DNA itself. And the fourth thing, of course, is the internet, because it's putting patients together in a way that empowers them and begins to drive the bringing together of the people who are going to drive the science behind finding the solution. So those four things I'd say. I'd say one more thing. 2003, January 2003, I ran an evening, co-led an evening at the World Economic Forum with Francis Collins, who was head of the Human Genome Project at the time. Remember, this was 6 months after it had been announced. And I kind of annoyed him in my part of the discussion by saying, actually, it's not going to do much good the next 10 years or so, having spent all that money on it. And he wasn't pleased with me. But 10 years later, he published actually saying, actually, we haven't got much from it in 10 years. What I also said was, it will take 15 to 20 years, because if you look at what's called the S-curve of technology development, that is the kind of timeline from a breakthrough in a technology to when it actually starts to pay back. We're now in that payback phase. So even though, 1990s, yes, too early, but now is the right time. It is going to help.
Yeah, I guess sort of along similar ways is very much the World Wide Web, and Google is what I think that's been most empowering for patients, because it's allowed communities and information to share without having to be gatekeepered, whether it be by purposeful kind of control or whether it just by time resources, that patients now can share information and inform themselves globally and not wait just for their 10 minutes appointment with their specialist doctor to try and get any information. And that's completely changed the dynamics. I think at the same time, we have become a generation of sort of instant gratification. So we do expect information, data. We get frustrated if something takes more than a few minutes to download on our app. And so while that's happening on one way of our living, for patients and the patient community to then have to move back to this archaic healthcare provision, it is driving the change that they want to see the changes in their diagnosis, in their disease management, to be more aligned with the way that they live their lives in other areas. And that expectation and that opportunity to be empowered with information and communities, for me, is the stronger way of giving inpatient patients the power to move this forward.
So my comments, I agree completely with what Elin says. For us, the biggest impact has been the ability for patients and families to share their lived experience, and for that lived experience to be taken seriously by companies developing new treatments and by the regulators as well. So when I say lived experience, this falls within the category of information that people now call real-world data. So rather than saying one single technology, I would rather talk about how technology in general has enabled real-world data in rare disease to become available to support research. So to give it a slightly historical context, I think it's probably the past decade or so where pharma companies have become increasingly switched on to the opportunities in electronic medical records because they recognize that they far better reflect the patient experience than what is captured in the clinical trial. And in rare disease where data is patchy, it's really great if you can aggregate electronic medical record data from different sources. So the great news is that there are now companies that have been founded and established just to do just that. The problem is that the electronic medical records don't really give a comprehensive view of the entire patient experience. It's often said that they represent maybe just 5% of what patients go through day to day. And that's probably an overestimate, probably. So the question is, well, what about the other 95% of the patient experiences when people are not in front of a doctor? And that's where tech comes in. That's where tech companies have gone direct to patients and caregivers, gathered the lived experiences of patients and caregivers, and created that 360 patient view. So to give, again, a historical context, if you saw Paul speak earlier, so his previous company, Patients Like Me, was very much a pioneer in patient-powered research, that model, going back 15 years or so. And that's very much where we sit today. But what I also noticed is that there's also patient advocacy and tech partnering to achieve similar aims. So last year, there was the leading Duchenne group in the US, PPMD, partnered with a digital health tech company. And they've now created a data warehouse that combines patient-reported data, clinician-reported data, and the EMRs. So for me, it's very encouraging that tech and patient groups and tech are working together to empower patients to share their experiences.
And that's a great point. I can see on Glisser that there's the most rated question is about patient registries. And so I'm wondering if we could expand a bit more around the data, the tech, and how those can come together to really help empower patients and improve their quality of life.
I guess I can elaborate on, again, Tanya was mentioning one example where the International Gaucher Alliance is leading the project of bringing, essentially competitors in terms of the pharmaceutical industry to work in a pre-competitive space of sharing data. And if we can get pharmaceutical companies to understand that data is a different asset, the more that we use it and the more that we share it, the more value it becomes, which is quite different to other assets that investors tend to be interested in. And that requires different ethical frameworks. And for me, what's really exciting about the project with the International Gaucher Alliance is that the patient community becomes the gatekeeper, the data owner, the governance. Because one of the biggest risk factor in the rare disease communities, as I see it at the moment, is the way that data is being owned and processed and that kind of thing. So by using data registries, you can identify patients for clinical trials, you can validate new outcomes, you can provide a better information of the natural history studies and global variation in phenotypes, and ultimately can support the pharmacoeconomic arguments that these drugs need to be reimbursed by the HTAs.
Yeah, no, I think we're all on the same page here, and I think Paul put it really importantly earlier. Actually, the genomics bit and the genetics is an important piece, but it's just a background. The really important thing is the detail, is the depth, the longitudinal data. And that is the thing that actually is going to change the most. And it will be embedded in lots of things, and the EHR is one of them, but it's your data. and individuals and patients have to actually, will have to take some level of engagement with that and responsibility for that. And the ownership word I think is a difficult word in terms of data, but actually the control of it ultimately is at the choice of the patient and must stay at the choice of the patient. But smart patients, and particularly patient groups, are going to realise that the more detailed longitudinal data that they can gather in their diseases, real-world data, longitudinal data, registries with genetics, with outcomes, with quality of life, the greater the data set and the chances of developing treatments quickly, be those symptomatic treatments, quality of life treatments, or moving on to cures. Because I do think the modalities that are there in many areas, particularly with genetic diseases, to do cures, but it is about your ability to gather that knowledge of the disease. And it's not simple. There's a thing called penetrance, which I think everyone, we all recognise that, having the gene doesn't actually result in the same disease in everyone, and understanding that is a key uncertainty going forward.
And even if having the gene results in the same disease, the symptomology varies enormously as well, across patients, between genders, and with age as well. So a lot of data needs collecting, and the more the patient groups can do, collect data, make it public, the faster we're going to be able to help people in the future.
And so we've talked a bit about previous technologies, and now we're going to try and have a quick look forward. So imagine, close your eyes, everyone, just for a second. Quick exercise. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Relax. And imagine you're living in a world where there are no more hospitals. Patient care is happening at home with your family, and patients are empowered. And the question now for you and for the panel is, okay, what are those key technologies and new waves that we expect in the next 20 to 30 years that will get us to that stage?
Well, I've already said, it won't be long before everyone has a genome, or at least everyone newly born will have a genome, and that's the background. Then it's about that longitudinal data set and what you can do with it, and I think that's going to come from multiple sources. It's going to come from wearables and sensors. It's going to come from electronic record. And so medicine changes from the first point of intervention being about one measurement in one point of time measured against a heterogeneous population to the first point of intervention in medicine is changes in your own longitudinal profile, and that does change medicine, the way that medicine works. And I think that that's going to allow you then to start moving towards the key things, which are early diagnosis, towards prevention, where prevention is an element, and where you will be able to move because you have early diagnosed patients and you'll understand how they're going to progress towards improved cures. Now, in terms of those treatments, I think the key here is multimodalities, and then a change in the regulatory systems and the change in the way that the economics of developing a new therapy worked. And we heard a lot of the challenges earlier with Gaucher's, which I have to say, make no sense when potential drugs don't get there, and when those sorts of things happen. I have to think that there are a lot of the modalities there. I have to think some of the most precise curable modalities, which are gene-based, gene therapy, and RNA, there is a major challenge, and it's a technical challenge, and it's around targeted delivery, targeted cellular delivery. RNA is happening now in a big way because targeted delivery has been sorted to the hepatocyte. And there is an absolute tsunami of drugs coming along based on RNA at the hepatocyte. And that's because of GalNAc-directed technology. And if we can sit there and work out the targeted technology for that in every cellular type, we will speed up the delivery of new drugs, or the treatment of new drugs, to a whole series of things.
Okay, I'm going to say two things, one of which may be quite challenging, the other of which is very visionary, maybe 30 to 50 years away. First of all, and I can say this having been trained as a biochemist and chemist myself, I think we're far too focused on biochemistry and chemistry. I think there's far more to human health than that. Where does physics come into this? Electrical flows in the body, energy flows, really important. Hardly anybody is investigating it. There's a whole field of medicine there that needs investigation. Long-term vision, I think where we'll be, building what Andy said, is, yes, we will have wearables that are collecting information from our bodies in real time, transmitting it into the internet, comparing the data we're producing with a human database, looking for the nearest analogies of people in the past, the direction of travel for our health, and then giving us real-time feedback on maybe what lifestyle, maybe what medical interventions we need, so we can make adjustments early before we get serious health problems, in other words, preventive medicine. That should also help with diagnosis of rare diseases, because the symptomology is the diagnosis, and if the symptomology is being collected accurately, that can then be related back again to other patients with the same kind of disease. I think that's probably at least 30 years away. The technologies for each of the steps required are actually either in place or being developed at the moment. So it's just a question of putting the whole thing together.
Well, it's an interesting future that you paint, Tim. I know why you do it, because there's all these inefficiencies currently in the hospital system, and there's patients undergoing inferior experiences. And that's the patients, and then you've got doctors who are increasingly burnt out, stressed out, anxious and depressed because they spend all the time inputting data into the computer as opposed to treating to the patient. So what do we need in order to get there? I think it's probably a combination of consumer health tech and machines doing a lot of the heavy lifting that is currently done by humans in hospitals. So what the consumer tech might look like, it's all the things that you're familiar with. So services that allow remote or virtual appointments, which are already here, but it just needs more people to adopt them. Greater use of wearables, apps like the Aparito app and the Raremark app, which is coming, enabling research to be done remotely. And on the hospital side of things, it needs to become commonplace for machines to do the lion's share of things that are, well, they say that in AI, it's the things that are narrow that AI is very good at. So it might be reading the MRI scans, or it might be converting a doctor's recorded notes into written electronic notes. So all of that, I think, would relieve a lot of the burden on doctors. I'm going to throw the question back to you, though, and say, because I've just finished a book, which is excellent, called Deep Medicine by Eric Topol. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend that you do. And to say, well, is this vision of the future without hospitals desirable at all? Is that something we should aim for? I absolutely agree that a future without inefficiencies in hospitals is what we want. But I believe that even in the future where patients are completely digitally connected and using apps and wearables, if they're unwell, they're still going to want to see a doctor in person, I believe. And if it's done well, there's nothing that beats an actual face-to-face meeting with a doctor. And let's not forget that doctors get into the profession because they want to treat patients. So if they've got no opportunity to do that in person, then it might become a less appealing profession to get into.
And I think Amazon are working on a doctor home delivery, so you get the doctor dropped instantly on the man.
Same day.
Same day.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, and I guess, probably ask the audience on this question, but a lot of adolescents, children, young people, they don't actually want to be reminded of their disease every single day, and therefore their home is their sanctuary, their home is their safe place, and therefore this concept of turning their homes into a hospital, for me, it doesn't necessarily kind of fit immediately with yes, no patient likes to drive for hours and spend time in hospitals, but actually I'm not sure that the unexpected consequences of delivering all this care and everything in a hospitalized sort of big brother, ITU equivalent wearable kind of analytic space would allow the patients to continue to having their protected, safe space where they can at times try and live their day-to-day life without the reminders that that they're being impacted by the disease. So I do wonder whether this vision is actually the right thing and what the unexpected consequences of it may be. But I certainly feel that the role of technology and the role of data is to, exactly like you said, to do the heavy lifting, to allow the more personal interaction with nurses and doctors and healthcare professionals, because human touch is what we all essentially need.
Thank you. So we'll have a look at Glisser, and thank you everyone for being so active there. So the second question is, how can we use AI to identify patients with R&D earlier in the journey? Can we help doctors by flagging up those patients? Is it real, hype? Is it happening now already?
I think it's already happened in a couple of instances. We know that by doing deep mining of highly occurring symptoms and picking up the trajectory, you can help to identify. It just requires sort of really understanding the disease journey for a few patients, from they had a lot of ear infections that required a lot of antibiotics. They had a lot of recurring UTIs. So these very common sort of symptoms that happen at more frequent intervals. And then you also have the challenge of unstructured data, where lots of different pediatricians, clinicians use different words to explain the same symptoms, and therefore it requires a bit more NLP processing. But it's already happening, just not possibly at a scale that we would like it to see it.
So then the next question is, how do we get regulators, researchers, and industry to work together to agree standardized endpoints that can be measured remotely?
I guess I'll take this one as well, just having worked as a regulator. I mean, one of the examples, of course, is Duchenne UK funded us to collaborate with Sysnap, a French-based company that's developed a very highly sophisticated wearable device to monitor ambulation. So as we're probably aware, the 6-minute walk test has been the sort of the reference endpoint used in many of the Duchenne clinical trials, and is not reflective of the day-to-day challenges. And so the EMA qualified the velocity of stride as a secondary endpoint for Duchenne studies, and also advised on what additional longitudinal data would be. So the EMA has a qualification procedure, which in my view, as an ex-regulator, is really not being utilized to its full capacity by pharmaceutical industry and the community at large to push this concept forward and to get that early dialogue with regulators happening. But it is starting. It just requires early investment by pharmaceutical companies or very proactive patient communities and academics to drive it through.
Okay, we have just been told by Alistair that we have time for one more question. So which one should we pick? Let's go on the next one down. Would patient support groups benefit from some kind of effective gathering useful data pack or framework, and what would it be? And I think on patient groups as well, one of the challenges is that, and I'll answer the next question, as the patient groups, you are the disease experts, and so a lot of the responsibility will be put on you. We want you to, take care of your family and children. We want you to run the patient group. We want you to get involved in drug discovery. We want you to set up a high-tech patient registry where we can run machine learning algorithms on it. And so there's enormous amounts of expectations which are not really realistic. And so I think the solution very much comes from technology that is simplified and that people can pick up, where you can be a mom CEO somewhere in Nottingham and get started. And so all of that is happening. And going back to the question, then are there more comments around a possible framework to help patient groups around their data management and the impact they can have around sharing useful information on their disease?
Yeah, I think there's a very clear path of what data is needed, and it's not that difficult to put a simple guide together. Whether anybody's done that, I don't know. But it's things like what are the symptoms of the disease? When was the genetics determined? What treatments are patients trying themselves, because they inevitably are, and what results they're getting, starting to collect that information so it's available. Testing those treatments against the transcriptome for the disease, etc. Helping patient groups understand the whole translation pathway from genetic disease through to a treatment, what it takes to do that, because it is complicated. But all those things are pretty easy to put in a document and help people. There's no reason why it can't be done.
Well, okay, so we'll close with one final comment, and then Alistair will tell you about the rest of the day. So I don't know if most people know, but Cambridge, there are about 4,000 startups around the university and the Genome campus. So it's actually the first tech and biotech cluster in Europe. So we're talking about technology. So I'd like to ask if any of you are involved in a startup, could you please raise your hand? Okay, great. Could you now stand up? Come on, don't be shy. Okay, awesome. So for those of you who form patient groups, have a look at those people and talk to them during the break, because those are the people who are inventing the new solution and technologies that could help you. Most startups at some point have to pivot, so maybe if their idea is not your solution today, they may solve it tomorrow. So, thank you.